it's Em again with your weekly RP Spotlight. I'm very excited about the guest we have today. We have Pax and his nation, the Tusacaway. Pax, how are you today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I am doing fantastic.
I'm sure you're glad to be chatting with a fellow Albertan for once.
Absolutely. Canadian gang for life.
Of course.
So I want to start off by asking a question that was asked last. Kind of interesting. How did you come to TNPRP in the first?
Oh, well, I've always been very interested in politics, in government and stuff, even since I was in like junior high school. Like I was very like interested in all that kind of stuff. And, additionally I was a nerd. So obviously I literally looked up like, is there any like government simulation games, anything interesting like that? And that's how I discovered NS. And, as everyone does, they start out with, nation side game, like gameplay or whatever. And then eventually I discovered, RMBRP, and that's how I really got into TNPRP.
Okay. So
and that was about... No, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, I interrupted you there. You go ahead.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah, and that was about in 2016, I think. Yeah, when I came to TNP, at least.
So you were also pretty heavily involved in Strange Reel, the RMP side RP when you first arrived. I believe you still are somewhat.
No, not as of yet.
No.
Not as of late, I mean.
Okay. So let's move on to our usual line of interrogation.
Of course.
So with the Tusacaway, it is heavily Native American inspired, mostly Plains Cree and a few other ones that I've unfortunately forgotten at the moment. How did you come to start using those as sources of inspiration?
Well, you see, when I was transitioning over from SR to Eris, I didn't have very many ideas, or at least any ideas I thought were original. So initially, I was going to call the Tusacaway Tusac in French. So it was going to be like a French spelling of that, and it was going to be some sort of French speaking nation, at the very least. And the name I actually got inspired by the town of Tadoussac, which is a ancien Québécois town in Canada. And then I entered university around that time, and we were beginning our introduction to Canadian history course with very Indigenous themed units. We started studying the cultural groups across the Americas, and I was doing a lot of research on First Nations, Métis, and the Inuit at that time. And I decided, no, you know what? Like, let's do something interesting. Let's do something unique, and let's try and implement some of this into my nation.
Awesome. So you have also done a really fantastic job of portraying Native American culture and language in a really, really positive way. Where is it that you have actually been able to find these Indigenous languages and work with them just as like a world building resource for others?
Sure, and I'm actually really glad you asked that, because it's a huge struggle to find good, accurate information about the Indigenous peoples of the America, or at least archives and cultural studies, because European stuff is, and whatever, like discrimination and privilege, whatever. But I find most of my resources within Canadian history textbooks, and I use Canadian Encyclopedia a lot to do studies on Plains Cree culture and Haudenosaunee culture. But I think the most interesting thing is the repository I use to come up with Plains Cree words. So the Tusacaway's language, which I call Tusacaway, is essentially a variant of Plains Cree. And fortunately, the University of Alberta, which, in the province of Alberta, has made a huge dictionary for just writing down and composing all of the different Plains Cree words that were available at the time. And there's a few other sources I use. There's this other Plains Cree Direct Dictionary. There's this source called the Alberta Elders Cree Dictionary, which unfortunately doesn't run anymore because Flash went down in December, and I can't use that anymore. But I prefer to use the University of Alberta's archives because they're specifically Plains Cree, and it's the most convenient for me.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you've also world built a variety of ethnic groups within the Tusacaway.
Yes.
Would you care to explain a little bit about some of those ethnic groups for us?
Yeah, of course. So the Tusacaway, as I have roleplayed it, began as a primary civilization, and that grew in the Middle Ages to be 5 distinct nations. Now, this is where it gets difficult because I'm going to have to pronounce all these things. But essentially, there were 5 initial nations on the face of the Tusacaway. And eventually, through a series of wars and different national conflicts, there came to be 3 dominant nations in the Tusacaway, the area that would become the Tusacaway. Those were the Mistamic, the Mayapisk, and the Akimaskapu. And those ended up, being the 3 dominant nations on the Tusacaway. And as the Tusacaway transitioned into a unitary state through a confederation, those, ethnic backgrounds didn't vanish. And so those became the nationalities of the Tusacaway. Unfortunately, the philosophical principle of the Tusacaway is unitary in nature. So it was all about being wholesome, acting as one. And so there came to be not a lot, but quite large conflicts that were, ethnic in their basis. So what happened was they basically the government of the Tusacaway at the time in the 1800s renamed all of the ethnic groups into ones that were more spiritually significant rather than ethnically significant, and that way it was to represent each ethnic group was just as valuable a component as the other. And so these ethnic groups are now called the whale, the turtle, and the whale, the turtle, and the pelican clans.
Okay. So you're talking about how they're grouped together by spiritual significance, and I know in a lot of Native American cultures, spirituality plays a big role. So I would like to ask about Tusacaway's national religion, animism. Of
course. So animism is like the English name I gave it. I called it animism because I feel like that's easier for more people to understand from a outsider point of view. And of course that's an exonym, but the endonym for the religion of the Tusacaway is called Manitoan. And the inspiration for that religion, it really varies. I used mostly Plains Cree sort of animistic, naturalistic religion as a sort of basis. But I was really inspired by Iroquois Haudenosaunee religion for deities and for spiritual way of life. So it is believed essentially in the Tusacaway that the Manitou, who is the central deity, is this sort of embodiment of the universe, of the land, of everything, and everything is part of him, and he is part of everything. And there's a variety of different sagas and tales about him that are spread out and used in different situations and told, and of course oral tradition plays a big role in that. And there's a lot of stories about how he formed the land. The most important one is, of course, the background for the ethnic groups, which it basically just there's a tale in which the Manitou leaves humanity in the possession of the whale, the pelican, and the turtle, and for that reason, the whale, the pelican, the turtle are very sacred creatures in the Tusacaway. Another interesting tale is how the bison came to be the sort of antagonist of the Manitou. So in animism, the bison is sort of this like trickster kind of figure, kind of like Loki. Like they don't keep their word and everything. And that's supposed to explain why they are hunted so frequently, and of course why they're so like I guess dumb in a way. Is I basically explained that like the Manitou, basically was punishing them for not being loyal to him and to the land, and made them dumber, made them weaker, stuff like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on to something a little less religious, your government structure is quite unique, as are the titles for what would probably be ministers. Let's kind of touch on that a little bit here.
Okay.
The structure of your government.
Yeah. Okay. So when the Tusacaway united, the government that embodied this new confederacy was the Nistocamic. Nistocamic means three houses, and once again, the idea of three nations coming together is why it's called the Nistocamic. The Nistocamic is this body of these individuals called chiefs, and chiefs are the leaders of town jurisdictions, which are called chieftaincies. Each town has a chief, and each chief is represented in the Nistocamic. So in that way, you can say that the Tusacaway is kind of like a representative democracy. Although it's interesting in that each member doesn't represent any real defined constituency. They're essentially like a mayor. They oversee the affairs of the town. I should also add that these chiefs aren't elected by the people; they are picked by the Great Mother, and that's another figure in the Tusacaway. The Great Mother is this matriarchal queen figure, which I obviously took a direct inspiration from the Iroquois on this, because their society was also heavily inspired, and their government heavily inspired by I believe it's the clan mother. They call them the clan mother of each clan. And so, yeah, each chief is selected by her, our matriarchal great mother of the Tusacaway, and as is the chieftain. So, of course, all the chiefs are elected or selected by the Great Mother. They meet in the Nistocamic, and that's where all the discussion happens. Although there is a figure, a leading figure in the Tusacaway, who acts as a sort of prime minister, and that is the chieftain. So the chieftain is the head of government, but officially he is equal among all. He's just sort of a representative of that body, and he embodies the nation diplomatically, and he's a liaison between the Great Mother and the Nistokamic. Alongside the chieftain, there's the spirit chief and the war chief, which is another parallel from Iroquois governance, where there's the clan mother elects a civic chief, a spiritual chief, and a military chief, and that's also reflected here. So, spirit chief, of course, is concerns themselves with religious affairs and matters, and the war chief concerns himself with the military, with the police, the Okipa, and war in general.
So, in what you've written, the Tusacaway was a very isolationist place for a very long time. Why was that?
Okay, so there's a mix of OOC and IC in this answer. Essentially, the one of the main reasons why I made the Tusacaway isolationist was because coming into eras, there are already these magical, sort of lands that all sort of relied on each other, were already very well built, world built, lots of RP. And it was difficult for me to see the Tusacaway's place in that world already so well defined. So essentially, I just took the easy route and said, the country was isolationist up until this point. Of course, it wasn't the only reason. Being that my nation is also inspired by the Plains Cree, I wanted to go for a sort of conservative, sort of anti-foreign sentiment. And, there's always a sort of, this archetype of the Native American that's fears the outsider. But I didn't want to go for that. I wanted to make it more of a, make it more of a cultural principle rather than some sort of, stereotype. So I essentially made it so that the Tusacaway in Tussaquan religion was a sort of holy land, woven by the Manitou. That's another sort of animistic story. Additionally, once I started RPing with other nations, I made sure to have the interactions with foreign nations be very bitter and divisive and not nice. And for that reason, I could justify a sort of a longing to not be involved in other countries' affairs and be isolationist.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you've kind of talked about when you first joined Eris. What brought you to Eris in the first? What really drew?
I mean, nothing in particular. I think what really brought me into Eris was just that I kind of felt, of course, I've been RPing on SR for the past, 4 years, how many years it's been since 2016. And, I really enjoyed it there. And, I still enjoyed it up until I joined Eris. But I just saw I was kind of getting tired, I was kind of getting tired of the Fusian Empire that was my SR nation. I was getting a little bit bored. I didn't find any real compatible nations to RP with. I felt a little bit like I was sort of just doing it all for myself. And I just found that, if I transitioned to Eris and tried something new, it might be interesting. And, I was right. It was, it's been a lot of fun so far.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So with the community, this is a question I like to ask. Is there anybody you really kind of look up to in the Eris community as, a creator, a writer, a world builder?
Yeah, I hear you ask this question a lot. And the answer is going to sound very cliche, but honestly, everyone. I really don't like to look up to one specific person. I don't like to, I like idolize one figure, idolize anyone. I like to do what I like to do, and I really enjoy seeing what everyone else in the community has to offer. And I personally, like, everyone who I've met has left some sort of good impression on me, and for that reason, I say, you know, the entire community in and of itself has been a great inspiration.
Well, that's pretty awesome. This, so kind of going back to Strange Rail here with your history with that.
Mm-hmm.
You would probably say that it's a good entry point for most people coming into the RP. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course.
We haven't had a lot of opportunity to get many people from Strange Reel on the program yet. We're hoping to do that fairly soon. So
no, yeah, like it's where most people start. It's where most people, you know, develop their techniques, and a bunch of my friends are still there in SR, and I still enjoy them. You know, there's no sort of bias. There's no sort of whatever. It's all very good, and I have very fond memories from SR.
So another frequently asked question is what was your favorite RP to write up to this point?
Well, goodness.
It could be Eris, it could be the multitude of things you did with Kyoki Chidoku in SR.
Oh, it's very hard to pick between the two. For SR, I'll speak a little bit more generally. Definitely the RPs I did with Kyoki were some of the not the best writing I've ever done, but the most helpful, the most developmental writing I've ever done, because Kyoki, of course, is a very excellent RPer, and I, joining in like 7th, 8th grade or whatever, was not a very good writer. I was not that, you know, I didn't have the skill I had now. And so, you know, RPing with Kyoki was like incredible for me, because it allowed me to develop a lot of the skills that I have today. As for eras, the most enjoyable RP I think I've done so far has definitely been Powakon, the Chieftain's Son, which is sort of my main line RP, which follows the Chieftain's son, Kiskoak, son of Nikama and Pasca, who is the chieftain, on his Powakon, which is a spiritual journey that all Tusacaway, you know, young men take sort of as a rite of passage in, you know, finding their way in life. And yeah, that RP has just been an absolute blast to write, and I really appreciate, you know, everyone seems to really enjoy it, and I'm just like, yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite things I've ever written.
Yeah, I've had a chance to read a good bit of The Chieftain's Son, and I have to say I've very much enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
So, with everything that you have, do you see like a clear path forward with the Tusacaway? Like, what does the future hold?
Absolutely. I do see it. Of course, I see a future for the Tusacaway. So just recently, the Tusacaway had a nationwide referendum, which is very unique for the country. You know, it doesn't happen very often, but essentially, it was for opening up to different nations, and opening up to foreigners, and considering foreign affairs, and, you know, things like that. And, you know, I wanted to do that very delicately and take it very slow paced, because I feel like, you know, if I'm RPing a nation here, I want to do that quite slowly, because that's how it would work in real life. And honestly, from now until the end of the year, all I foresee doing is just making contact with other nations, doing some trade, maybe doing some RPs, like some different diplomatic initiatives. I also see continuing Powakon, because it's not done yet. It's the main storyline is over, like his Powakon is done, but his Kiskoak's journey, of course, isn't over. And I'm doing an RP with Pry at the moment about the first encounter with Prydanian Vikings, which has been awesome to write. And of course, I have this new RP that I'm writing about the 1954 constitutional crisis in the Tusacaway, which is another diplomatic incident, which I could ramble about, but I'll just leave it at that.
You know what? No, let's touch on that. What's
Sure.
the kind of basis of that constitution?
Okay, yeah. So the constitutional crisis of 1954 is the closest the Tusacaway has ever gotten to really ending or being fractured. So its origin, the conflict's origin, is it basically dives into spiritual differences related to the ethnic groups, as I mentioned before. One of the biggest issues between the ethnic groups at the time was spirituality. What was the true nature of their religion? And it seemed to vary very much among the different groups. And the spirit chief of the Tusacaway really handled that poorly and ended up defaming his own college of priests, and it was a massive scandal. And that basically was the foundation for the Quimicon movement in the Tusacaway. So Quimicon is the name of the RP about the 1954 constitutional crisis. And Quimicon, I don't remember the literal IRL definition, but I've defined it as tribalism or division or separatism, sovereigntism, words like that. And that push from the religious separation made the Tusacaway very divided and made some groups of people believe that there should be separate countries again, 3 separate countries, and that's how the country would work best. Those people were called the Quimiconu, and the more radical of them were called the Mikono, which would act. They're just the violent, young, rebellious force, extreme force of Quimicon. And they were a serious issue in the Tusacaway. And even more serious was the fact that the Nistokamik was in shambles about that. So essentially, the Nistokamik, following Native American tradition, was abiding by consensual government. So there are no political parties, there's no political factions, there's no dominance, there's no cabinet ministers, there's nothing. Every person in the Nistokamik has the exact same power and authority as every other member of the Nistokamik. And this was starting to fall apart because people were now dividing themselves into parties based on Quimicon, separatism, and basically conservatism, conserving the consensual nature of the Tusacaway. Additionally, there were the hard consensualists who didn't even want to partake, didn't even want to entertain in that conservative Quimicon rivalry, and that's where that's where the conflict sort of lies. And it ended up being a big mess, and the Mikono formed their own state called the Miko Confederacy in the north of the Tusacaway, and it was finally put down. It was finally conquered back by the Great Mother, who basically had to act on her own authority because the government at the time was the POS. It wasn't working. They were constantly arguing about what to do, and the nation was kind of at a standstill while these Mikono Quimicon supporters were taking advantage of the northern prairie lands, which are the agricultural core of the Tusacaway, and it seemed all very ridiculous to the Great Mother. So she acted in her own authority to take back the land and restore order, and that's essentially how it went.
Well, I'm looking very forward to reading that once you've got it all fleshed out on the forum.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get into the one of my favorite segments of Vivanco's rapid fire random question.
I love it. Bring it on.
Here's a question from next week's guest, Ark and Stotska, also affectionately known as Ark. Will the Tusacaway seek to join pan-Kravitarian organizations like the CEA or the Bergen Pact?
Bergen Pact, I'll have to take another think about it. Of course, alliances are really different because in this point in time, the Tusacaway is only interested in bilateral agreements, bilateral diplomacy, and not comprehensive agreements like pacts, alliances, things like that. The CEA I have been really looking into recently, and I think when the time comes, I will eventually join the economic side of the Kraviter Economic Agreement. That's how I plan to, progress. But yeah, with regards to the Bergen Pact and alliancehood, I still have to do my research on those sorts of things, and it's not out of the question, but I'll consider it.
Okay, we're gonna move into some very random jump around territory here. Thanks to Vivanco. The first question: what kind of cheese is the most consumed?
Now, okay, so you might think that's a really stupid question, but I've actually world built this. Like literally yesterday, actually, by the way. So with regards to Tussaquan, cuisine, most of the animals on the Tusacaway are within the Tusacaway are. I made sure it was all very, like initial American livestock, which of course there was very little of that. So cheese is actually one of the greatest delicacies in the Tusacaway because there aren't any animals aside from bison that give milk on the Tusacaway. Or at least that give milk that can be used to make cheese or, different dairy dishes. So dairy in and of itself is quite a delicacy in the Tusacaway and is really reserved for, the people with the most power and influence, I guess, which would be, of course, the Great Mother, the chiefs, the chieftain, and, some business folks in the Tusacaway. So, bison milk, bison cheese, bison butter, like those things exist. They're real, but they are extremely delicate and they're hard to get your hands on.
Okay, and here's kind of a link in to that question, also from Vivanco. Pretty much all of these are going to be from Vivanco.
I love it.
Do people ride the bison?
No, dear God, do not ride the bison. Bison are very feral animals and they are undomesticated, so I wouldn't recommend it. Although I don't think it's out of the question that there has been at least one Tussaquan idiot who decided to jump on a bison and got himself killed. So yeah, don't ride bison.
So here's kind of a two-parter. Who is the best sportsman in the nation? The first part here.
I certainly haven't world built sports to the degree that I would like, especially sports figures. Although I should mention that lacrosse has a huge importance in the Tusacaway. Lacrosse is the main sport played in the Tusacaway, and I got that inspired by. I'm sure the Iroquois played it. I don't know if Western cultures played lacrosse or some variant of it. But talking about sports, lacrosse is definitely the big one.
Okay. And the second part of this question is, what is the strangest sport played in the Tusacaway?
Like I said, I haven't really worked it out. I mean, lacrosse in and of itself is quite a unique sport. But yeah, I mean, that's all I have to say there.
Okay. How would you describe the architecture of the main buildings of the country?
Yeah, good question. Of course, being inspired by the Plains Cree, yada yada yada. Teepees are, very important in the Tusacaway. The teepee structure was used in towns and settlements, like honestly up until the 20th century. I mean, people were still living in them. They were the unit of the household essentially, and they were very convenient for the Tuscawan people because the Tuscawan people migrated often, and it wasn't until solid industrialization and modernization that the modern architecture started popping up. And basically what that was more longhouse structures. So longhouses always existed in Tusacaway, even in medieval times, but they were reserved for the very wealthy because they're made of trees. And in the prairie lands where the Mistamek lived, there were only a few bluffs, and it was difficult to get your hands on, good solid wood. So longhouses were reserved for, the great mothers and chiefs, and for different services. Nowadays, the household, still called the longhouse, is still the unit of the family in the Tusacaway, or the clan. But they're of course constructed from more modern materials. They're a lot more colorful. I use St. John's, Canada, as the capital of the Tusacaway, which is called Tawayak, which means the center. And St. John's is very distinct in having those sort of like copy paste houses in different like bright colors, and it gives a very sort of fisherman kind of fishing village kind of vibe, where like every house is kind of like a copy of one another, but with different variations of each other.
Okay, so you mentioned fishing. What does the Tusacaway economy look like? Because I know fishing was probably a fairly large part of that.
Yeah, so let me get my resource map up here. So the economy of the Tusacaway operates very intrinsically on this ideology called physiocracy. Physiocracy is essentially the idea that agriculture is the primary basis for all economies, and that economic theory was developed in France in the late Renaissance, early modern period. And I thought that sort of conceptualization would be really interesting and would work well in a society that, is quite, down to earth like that. And so the Tuscawan economy revolves almost centrally off of agriculture. The main agricultural products being maize, corn, wild rice, and wheat and oats. And those are the primary agricultural products. Other interesting areas of the economy would be, logging, silviculture, of course. Fishing, as you said, is very important. Cod, salmon is fished. Those are also, that makes oil. That makes, both cooking oil and like lamp oil, I guess. If people still use lamp oil, they don't. But anyways, and for eating, there's also oil, which was interesting because the Tusacaway has cars and has industry that is reliant on fossil fuels. So the Tusacaway does extract its own bitumen, and mining, stuff like that. And of course, the hunt of bison is very important to the Tuscawan economy.
Okay. So we have a couple of other questions here. One from Art. Now that the nation is opening up, how do you see modern diplomatic interactions between Tusacaway and the Kingdom of Pridania working out?
Well, of course, me and Pry have to work it out before it happens, and the law that allows that serves this new foreign agenda in the Tusacaway. Literally just got ratified today. I just finished a post about it. But essentially how I see it is just, going to the different nations, sailing around the world and, meeting these nations, doing all of our agreements and diplomacy and all those affairs in their respective nations. I didn't want any nations to come to the Tusacaway because I feel like that wouldn't be what would be best, considering the referendum was very close when it comes to how people perceive outlanders and foreigners. So it's probably just a better idea to go to those nations rather than invite them to the Tusacaway. And with regards to IC, I really don't have anything beyond just starting an RP where it's essentially, a very basic diplomatic, negotiation between, two parties. Very simple. That's how I foresee it happening.
Okay. Another one from Vapia. Mm-hmm. What is the most important event in modern history in the Tusacaway?
Well, of course, the opening of the Tusacaway, the sort of relaxation on foreign policy in the Tusacaway is, of course, groundbreaking, and it's something that's never been seen before. I'd probably say the most influential event in the Tusacaway history was, of course, the Quimicon 1954 constitutional crisis. That was, that still has bearing on the Tusacaway's society today. So I would say that is the most important thing. Other important events would be, Confederation, which happened in 1694. And the treaty years, which was a time in which the Tusacaway entered into relations with the most serene state of Perdiche, in which they came to us, they administered, I would say, a treaty, and we began foreign trade with them. Of course, that ended in the year 1900.
Okay. So we're gonna jump back into the random stuff now. So, can people sue for 1 unit of currency or less?
What does that mean?
Like, if I sued you for $1, is that okay in the Tusacaway?
What? That's such a silly question.
I know.
Okay, well. With regards to legality in the Tusacaway, most affairs, most small petty affairs like that don't even qualify for the attention of the judiciary. Really, the only sort of legal aspect of the Tusacaway that falls under like state law is criminal law, which is dealt with by the Okipa. Civil law matters like that often there is no sort of court for that, at least not yet, and that is mostly due to the fact that the Tusacaway's culture is inherently collectivist and consensual, and people don't do something without thinking beforehand or considering the other person's feelings, and if that does happen, negotiation and talks are the most important way of coming out of that. So civil law is almost non-existent, but for criminal law, yes, there's certainly ways to deal with criminals in the Tusacaway.
Okay, another thing going into dubious legality are duels.
Pardon me?
Are duels legal?
No, do not duel. That is not seen as a productive way of resolving dispute in the Tusacaway. That is seen as, a very outlander way of solving problems.
So, with the Tusacaway's legal system, is restorative justice kind of a big thing?
Could you define restorative justice?
Restorative justice is like a system that's used in a lot of Native American communities, and it has been quite often throughout history. It's basically a form of justice that focuses on addressing the harm caused by crime while holding the offender responsible by their actions, by providing an opportunity for the parties directly affected by the crime to identify and address their issues and kind of work on them together.
I'm gonna have to
come to a resolution.
I would have to say no to that because in this time, the Okipa, which is the national police of the Tusacaway, or the National Guard, if you'd like it that way, controls basically all criminal sentencing. There is no courts in the Tusacaway. Your penalties and your most criminal law is dictated by the Okipa. And for that reason, I would say no to that because, the Okipa are meant to sort of represent this authoritarian sort of isolationist stain in the Tusacaway. And, their convictions are quite, quite solid and quite, based on authority and justice and things like that. So with that restorative justice, I will have to look into that because obviously that's something I've missed when researching, Aboriginal law. But until we introduce courts into the Tusacaway, which is something I have been planning, the courts would be called Pakakamaka. Until then, no, there is no restorative justice. It seems that most criminality is, punished very directly by the Okipa.
Okay. So, what is the oldest book in Tusacaway?
The oldest book in the Tusacaway.
Still in circulation.
Oh yeah, the oldest book in the Tusacaway is the Tusacaway Dictionary, which is the language of Pridania. So, when it was written, it wasn't a book, of course. It was a papyrus scroll, and it was written in 1088, and it is a basically a compilation of Makari and Tusacaway words translated. So it's what's it called? A lexicon, essentially. It also has some descriptions of Pridania. It has descriptions of the Tusacaway, different cultural aspects, flags, things like that. And it was meant to be this sort of, basically this just guide to this foreign nation. Of course, it wasn't really finished and it wasn't expanded further because the Viking Pridanians and the Mistamek Tussaquan didn't have relations for very long because it was kind of a bitter encounter, and it definitely left a bad impression in the Tusacaway. But that's the oldest book. The name of the book is called Itwe Wasin Inadikan.
It's quite the name.
I know. Yeah, Plains Cree tends to have very, very long words because they're based on like particles or whatever. Like it's something interesting about the language is that like the words are connected together to make new words or like actions, things like that.
Okay. Let me just check if we have any more audience questions. What is more popular, beer or wine?
Well, there is no alcohol in the Tusacaway, which might come as a surprise. They don't drink in the Tusacaway. They do use recreational substances, which are marijuana, and they have entheogens, religious entheogens, which are used in spiritual services. Of course, entheogens aren't used recreationally. And if you don't know what entheogens are, it's like acid. It's like LSD. Like it makes you trip balls, but it's it's specifically aimed for religious and spiritual purposes. Now, there was wine in the Tusacaway once during the aforementioned treaty years with the most serene state of Prediche. They imported wine into the Tusacaway, and so if there was any partiality to alcohol, wine would definitely be it.
All right. Is there a Declaration of Human Rights?
No. The closest thing we have to that is our Constitution, which is called the Maoiton Constitution.
So when Tusacaway opened up, was there kind of like a rush for people to go and see the outside world?
Certainly not, because the nature of the referendum was that there were two questions. The first question was, should we should we come into relation with other nations? That was the first question. The second question was, should the restriction of mobility be questioned? So, of course, you can't leave or enter the Tusacaway. Mobility rights don't exist, which, take that as you will. And a lot of people, although they were in favor of, expanding our foreign agenda, were still apprehensive about mobility rights and foreign travel. So I'm sure there is I'm sure some people would really love to get out there, and I'm sure there's people who would be interested in that. For the most part, the people of the Tusacaway have been raised to believe that the outside world doesn't have a place for them or wouldn't accept them. So for that reason, there isn't a great ruckus to get on out there and see the beautiful cathedrals of Saint-Ange or like other countries. So yeah.
Okay, so we have one last question.
Okay.
Is the technology of the Tusacaway on par with neighboring nations like Haitian or Mentoria? And if not, will the Tusacaway begin to have like modernization programs, and to what extent?
Okay. So on the topic of modernization, industrialization, of course, it's a very sensitive topic when you're talking about a culture that's inspired by the indigenous peoples of America. Because like people who are like, oh, you're so primitive. Oh, you fear the outside world. Like those are very simple archetypes, and I don't really like them because they don't have any basis, and people hold them without any real research or information. So when we're talking about technology, the Tusacaway, like just to be clear, the Tusacaway has industry. They have factories. They have power plants. They even had nuclear power. Okay, they used nuclear power to some point. Of course, they don't anymore because of environmental laws. And realistically, the Tusacaway has the means to develop high very advanced technology on their own. It's just that they have a very stagnant economy in general, and that's why the foreign opening happened in the first place. So is the technology on par with Haitian and Mentoria? Well, I haven't seen Haitian or spoke to him in a while. I mean, I really don't know if he's around that much anymore, so I haven't really had a chance to speak with him. With Mentoria, yeah, I'd say honestly, like I'm confident that the Tusacaway and Mentoria have the same level of technological development. It's really just about the employment or skill in that development.
Okay. And actually, we do have one more question because it is mandatory when Vivanco is recording. Do you want some Vivancola, which is his
Yes.
beef-based? Yes, excellent.
Give
Excellent
it all to me.
Oh,
Show
boy.
me the money.
Well, gang, that's our time for today. Thank you for tuning in to the latest edition of the RP Spotlight with our wonderful guest Pax.
Thank you.
Thank you to the Ministry of Radio for lending me Vivanco again. We will see you next week with a brand new episode featuring our good friend here, Arkan Stotska, Ark, and he'll be speaking about his nation. All right, guys, gals, and non-binary pals, have a good night.
Bye for now.